In 1957, when workers demolished the New Orleans convent, rosaries rattled alone across the rubble. Frank Mercer, the foreman of the demolition crew, watched with unease as the silver crucifix slid across the broken stone. The humid September air hung heavy around him, making his shirt cling to his back as sweat trickled down his spine. He'd overseen dozens of demolitions in his 15 years on the job, but something about St. Agatha's convent felt different. "You see that?" Frank asked his assistant, a young man named Tommy who'd only been on the job for 3 months. Tommy nodded, his face pale beneath his hard hat. "Wind, probably," he said, not sounding convinced even to himself. But there was no wind that day in the French Quarter. The air was still as death. Frank crossed the site, boots crunching over plaster and shattered tile. He bent down to pick up the rosary, the beads warm against his palm despite having been buried under stone. "We should get back to work," he said, pocketing the rosary. "Developer wants this cleared by the end of the week." The developer, West Lane Properties, had purchased St. Agatha's after the diocese had finally closed it 2 years ago. The convent had stood empty since 1953, when the last of the nuns had either died or been relocated. Now it would become luxury apartments with a view of the Mississippi. As the day wore on, Frank couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Twice he turned suddenly, certain he'd catch someone standing behind him, but there was never anyone there. Just the broken walls of the convent, windows like empty eye sockets staring back at him. When the crew broke for lunch, Frank walked to the remaining wing of the building, the only section still intact. The chapel would come down tomorrow. He stepped through the doorway, taking off his hat in a gesture of respect that surprised even himself. The chapel was small, with simple wooden pews and a modest altar. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting colorful patterns across the floor. Frank moved slowly down the aisle, drawn to a small door behind the altar. The door was locked, but as he touched the handle, he heard it. A soft, distant sound of women chanting. Frank pressed his ear to the wood. The voices rose and fell in Latin, a language he recognized from his childhood attending Mass with his mother. "Hello?" he called. "Is anyone in there?" The chanting stopped abruptly. Tommy's voice called from outside. "Boss? You in here?" Frank stepped back from the door, suddenly embarrassed. "Yeah, just checking the structure." As he turned to leave, he noticed a small plaque beside the door. It read, "Archives, authorized personnel only." That night, Frank couldn't sleep. The rosary sat on his nightstand, and occasionally he thought he heard it move, beads clicking softly against the wood. His wife, Margaret, slept soundly beside him, untroubled by the strange atmosphere that had followed him home from the convent. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of a young woman in a novice's habit, her face half hidden by her veil. She stood in a stone corridor, beckoning to him. "You must see," she whispered, "before it's too late." Frank woke with a start, sweat-soaked and gasping. The bedside clock read 3:33 a.m. The rosary was gone from his nightstand. Frank arrived at the demolition site earlier than usual the next morning. The sky was still tinged with pink, and mist clung to the ground, wrapping around the broken stones of St. Agatha's like spectral fingers. He hadn't told Margaret about the missing rosary. What would he say? That he believed it had somehow returned to the convent on its own. He made his way to the chapel, still standing amid the destruction. The door was unlocked now, swinging open at his touch as if inviting him in. Inside, the chapel looked different in the early morning light, older somehow, as if he had stepped back in time. The wooden pews gleamed with fresh polish, and candles flickered on the altar, though no one had been there to light them. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the small door behind the altar. It was ajar. Beyond the door, a narrow staircase spiraled downward. The air that rose from below was cold and smelled of damp stone and something else, something faintly medicinal. Frank hesitated, then began his descent. The stairs led to a long corridor lined with wooden filing cabinets and bookshelves. The convent archives. Dust motes danced in the beam of Frank's flashlight as he moved deeper into the room. One cabinet stood open, a single folder on top labeled 1928 to quarantine. Frank opened the folder. Inside were photographs and handwritten reports. The first photograph showed a group of nuns standing outside St. Agatha's. Their expressions were solemn, and they stood unusually far apart from one another. The second showed what appeared to be a makeshift infirmary set up in the convent's main hall. Beds lined the walls, each occupied by a still form. The reports detailed an outbreak of influenza that had swept through New Orleans in 1928. St. Agatha's had been converted into an emergency hospital when city facilities became overwhelmed. The nuns had volunteered to care for the sick, despite the risk to themselves. Frank flipped through the pages, a sense of dread building as he read accounts of the mounting death toll. Then he came to a report dated November 12, 1928, written by the Mother Superior, Sister Agnes Boudreau. Today we buried Sister Marie Claire, the fifth of our order to succumb to the illness, the neat handwriting stated. The city has ordered that all bodies be buried quickly to prevent further spread of disease. With the cemetery unable to accommodate more, we have been instructed to use our own grounds. Frank lowered the report. They had buried people here, on the convent grounds, the very ground that was now being excavated for the foundation of luxury apartments. A soft sound reached his ears, the gentle clicking of rosary beads. Frank turned slowly. At the far end of the corridor stood a figure in a nun's habit, her face obscured by shadow. In her hands she held the rosary that had disappeared from his nightstand. "Sister?" Frank's voice cracked. The figure remained silent but raised one pale hand, beckoning him to follow. Then she turned and moved deeper into the archives. Frank pursued her, turning a corner to find another staircase, this one leading even further down. The air grew colder, the smell stronger, not just medicine now, but something underneath it, something rotten. The nun descended, her habit whispering against the stone steps, the clicking of the rosary beads growing louder, more insistent. Frank followed, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he rushed to keep up. The staircase ended in a large circular chamber with a low ceiling. The walls were lined with niches, each sealed with a brick panel. Frank realized with horror that he was standing in a crypt. The nun stood in the center of the room, finally still. As Frank approached, she slowly raised her head, revealing her face. Half of it was missing, the skin and muscle gone to reveal bone beneath, a gaping wound that could only have been caused by the most virulent form of the disease she had died trying to treat. Frank stumbled backward, a scream caught in his throat. The nun's one remaining eye fixed on him, not with malice but with an intense urgency. She raised a skeletal finger to what remained of her lips, signaling for silence, then pointed to the far wall of the crypt. Unlike the other walls with their sealed niches, this one featured a large wooden door bound with iron. Frank approached it cautiously, the beam of his flashlight revealing a heavy padlock securing it shut. When he looked back, the nun was gone, but the rosary lay on the ground where she had stood. Frank picked it up, his hand shaking. As his fingers closed around the beads, images flashed through his mind. Dozens of bodies wrapped in sheets being carried down these very stairs. Nuns in masks praying over them. A city official ordering the door sealed and records destroyed. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Behind that door lay more bodies, perhaps dozens, perhaps hundreds victims of the influenza outbreak sealed away and forgotten. The sound of footsteps above broke his reverie. Bork crew was arriving. "Boss? You down there?" Tommy's voice echoed down the stairwell. "Yeah," Frank called back, his voice steadier than he expected. "Found something interesting. Come see." By mid-morning, Frank had contacted the city authorities. Work was halted as health officials and historians descended on St. Agatha's. The discovery of the crypt made the afternoon papers, with reporters questioning how such a significant site could have been approved for demolition without proper investigation. Frank didn't tell them about the nun with half a face. He kept that part to himself, along with the rosary, which now stayed in his pocket where he could touch it occasionally to reassure himself he hadn't imagined the whole thing. The developers were furious about the delay, but could do nothing in the face of the historical preservation order that was quickly slapped on the remaining structures. Frank was fired that same day, but he didn't care. He knew he'd done the right thing. What he didn't know was that his connection to St. Agatha's was far from over. That night, as he sat in his living room explaining to Margaret why he was suddenly unemployed, there was a knock at the door. A young woman in a smart business suit introduced herself as Catherine Doucette from the Louisiana Historical Society. "Mr. Mercer, I understand you're the one who discovered the crypt," she said, her Creole accent soft but clear. "I was wondering if you could tell me exactly how you found it." Frank invited her in, offering coffee, which she declined. He told her about finding the archives, the folder about the quarantine, but left out the spectral nun who had guided him. "The influenza pandemic of 1928 hit New Orleans particularly hard," Catherine explained. "Nearly 5,000 people died in the city alone. What's strange is that there's almost no record of St. Agatha's role as an emergency hospital. It's as if someone wanted that history erased." "But why?" Margaret asked, now fully invested in the story. Catherine hesitated. There were rumors, rumors that the death toll at St. Agatha's was unusually high, even considering the circumstances. Some suggested that not all those who died there succumbed to influenza. A chill ran down Frank's spine. "What do you mean?" "Some of the nuns kept private journals. One account suggests that as resources dwindled and more sisters fell ill, patients were neglected, perhaps even hastened to their end through morphine, overdoses, or simply by withholding care from those deemed unlikely to survive." Frank remembered the nun's face half destroyed, Not by disease, he now realized, but by decay, and her urgent need to show him the sealed door. They were hiding evidence, he said softly. Catherine nodded. That's my theory. And now that the crypt has been found, we have a chance to uncover the truth and give proper recognition to those who died there. After Catherine left, promising to keep Frank updated on their findings, he sat alone in his darkened living room. Margaret had gone to bed, exhausted by the day's events. Frank took out the rosary, running the beads through his fingers. As he did, he felt a presence in the room with him. Looking up, he saw her, the nun with half a face, standing in the corner. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. In response, she raised her hand. In it, she held not a rosary this time, but a key. The key gleamed in the nun's skeletal hand, ancient iron that somehow caught the dim light of Frank's living room. She extended it toward him, her remaining eye fixed on his face with that same urgent expression. Frank rose from his chair, heart pounding. "Is that for the door in the crypt?" The nun nodded slowly, then placed the key on the coffee table between them. It landed with a heavy thud that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet house. Then, like mist dissolving in sunlight, she faded from view. Frank stared at the key. It looked solid enough, though it hadn't been there a moment ago. He picked it up, surprised by its weight and the chill that seemed to radiate from the metal. He knew what the nun wanted him to do, but the thought of returning to that crypt, of opening that sealed door. Sleep eluded him that night. He lay awake, the key and the rosary on his nightstand, occasionally catching glimpses of movement at the corners of his vision. When he did drift off near dawn, his dreams were filled with whispered Latin prayers and the sound of weeping. Morning brought no clarity, only a bone-deep certainty that he couldn't ignore what was happening. After Margaret left for her job at the library, Frank called Catherine Doucette. "I need to get back into the convent," he told her without preamble. "Mr. Mercer, that might be difficult. The site is under lockdown while they document everything in the crypt." "Please," Frank insisted. "It's important." Something in his voice must have convinced her. "I'll meet you there at noon," she said after a pause. "Can't guarantee they'll let us in, but I'll try." Agatha's looked different in the bright midday sun. Yellow police tape surrounded the site, and a handful of official vehicles were parked nearby. Workers in white coveralls moved in and out of the chapel entrance. Catherine was waiting for him, her expression concerned. "Are you all right, Mr. Mercer? You look like you haven't slept." "I'm fine," he lied. "Were you able to arrange access?" She nodded. "Dr. Broussard from Tulane is supervising the excavation. He's agreed to let us observe for a short while, but we can't interfere with their work." Dr. Broussard turned out to be a thin, scholarly man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual frown. He greeted Catherine warmly, but eyed Frank with suspicion. "Miss Doucette says you're the one who found the crypt," he said. "Quite a discovery. We've identified 37 distinct burial niches so far, all dating to the 1928 pandemic." "What about the sealed door?" Frank asked. "Doctor," Broussard's frown deepened. "Yes, that's proven to be something of a mystery. We haven't opened it yet, waiting for the proper equipment and permissions. The structure's quite old, possibly predating the convent itself." Frank felt the key burning in his pocket. "Could I see it?" The crypt looked different under the bright work lights the university team had set up. The shadows were gone, revealing the craftsmanship of the stone walls and the careful sealing of each burial niche. A small plaque had been placed beside each, documenting what little information they had been able to gather. The sealed door stood as Frank remembered it, imposing and dark. The padlock gleamed dully under the lights. "We'll need to cut through that," Dr. Broussard said, nodding at the lock. "Should have the equipment tomorrow." "No need," Frank said, pulling the key from his pocket. "I have this." Dr. Broussard stared at him in disbelief. "Where did you get that?" Frank ignored the question, approaching the door. Before anyone could stop him, he inserted the key into the padlock. It turned with surprising ease, the mechanism clicking open after nearly 30 years of disuse. "Mr. Mercer," Dr. Broussard protested, "this is completely irregular. We need to document everything before." But Frank was already removing the padlock and pulling open the heavy door. It swung inward with a groan of ancient hinges, revealing a darkness beyond that seemed to swallow the light. The smell hit them first, not the expected mustiness of a long-sealed chamber, but something sharper, more medicinal, formaldehyde. As their eyes adjusted, the contents of the room became clear. It was not, as Frank had expected, another burial chamber. It was a laboratory. Stone tables lined the walls, each bearing the remnants of scientific equipment: glass beakers, rubber tubing, primitive syringes. Shelves held dozens of jars containing cloudy liquid and unidentifiable specimens, but it was the center of the room that drew their attention. There, on a large stone table, lay a body perfectly preserved. sealed in what appeared to be a glass case. A young woman in a novice's habit, her face serene, her hands folded over her chest, clutching a rosary identical to the one in Frank's pocket. "My God," Catherine whispered. What were they doing here? The silence that followed Catherine's question seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by Dr. Broussard's ragged breathing. The preserved body of the novice lay before them, a macabre centerpiece to the hidden laboratory. Frank approached the glass case slowly, drawn by a terrible certainty. "Sister Marie Claire," he whispered, though he couldn't have explained how he knew her name. Dr. Broussard recovered his composure first, professional curiosity overriding his shock. "This is unprecedented," he said, adjusting his glasses as he examined the preservation setup. "These techniques are far beyond what was standard practice in the 1920s. Catherine moved to a desk against the far wall, where yellowed papers were stacked in neat piles. "Research notes," she said, leafing through them carefully. "Written by Sister Agnes Boudreau, the Mother Superior from the quarantine report," Frank remembered. He stood transfixed by the face of the young nun in the case. She looked asleep, not dead, her skin pale but not discolored, her features relaxed. According to the report he'd read, she had died of influenza, but she showed none of the telltale signs of the disease. "Listen to this," Catherine said, her voice tight with tension. "Subject 17 shows remarkable resilience to the modified strain. Fever persisted for 6 days but subsided without the hemorrhagic symptoms observed in subjects 9 through 16. Increased dosage recommended for subject 18. She looked up, horror dawning on her face. They weren't treating the influenza. They were studying it, experimenting with it. "That's absurd," Dr. Broussard protested, but weakly. "The nuns were caregivers." "Not all of them," Frank said, the pieces falling into place in his mind. The spectral nun, her face half destroyed, she had been trying to expose the truth. Sister Agnes and some of the others, they were using the outbreak as cover for experiments. "But why?" Catherine asked. "What possible reason could they have?" Frank's attention was drawn to a leather-bound journal that lay beside the preserved body. He opened it carefully, the brittle pages crackling under his touch. Inside was handwriting he recognized from the quarantine report, Sister Andress's neat, precise script. "God has granted us an unprecedented opportunity," he read aloud. "With the chaos of the outbreak, we can pursue our research without oversight or interference. The diocese would never understand the importance of our work. The potential to develop a weapon that could serve the greater good by targeting the undesirables that threaten our way of life." Dr. Broussard had gone pale. "A biological weapon? In a convent? That's not as strange as you might think," Catherine interrupted. "After the Great War, there was significant interest in biological warfare. And remember, this was 1928, so eugenics was considered legitimate science by many, including some Catholic institutions." Frank continued reading. "Sister Marie Claire discovered our true purpose and threatened to expose us. I had no choice but to silence her. The others believe she succumbed to the influenza like so many others. But I have preserved her here as a reminder of the sacrifices necessary for progress." The journal detailed how Sister Agnes and 4 other nuns had been secretly trained in medical research before joining St. Agatha's. They had used the convent as a cover for their real work, developing a more virulent strain of influenza that could be controlled and targeted. When the natural outbreak occurred, they saw it as divine providence, a chance to conduct human trials under the guise of emergency medical care. "The bodies behind the sealed niches," Frank said, looking up from the journal. "Those weren't influenza victims. Those were their test subjects." Catherine was systematically photographing every page of documentation with a small camera she'd pulled from her purse. "This can never be made public," she said grimly. "The damage to the church, to the historical record, the truth needs to come out," Frank interrupted. "These people deserve justice, even decades later." "I agree," Dr. Broussard said, surprising them both, but carefully, methodically. "This will need to be verified, contextualized." A soft sound interrupted them, the gentle clicking of rosary beads. All three turned to see the spectral nun standing in the doorway, more visible now than Frank had ever seen her. She was young, perhaps in her 20s, with kind eyes that contrasted sharply with the horrific wound that had taken half her face. Dr. Broussard stumbled backward with a choked cry. Catherine crossed herself instinctively, but Frank stood his ground. "Sister Marie Claire," he said softly, "we found the truth. We'll make it right." The nun nodded, a look of profound relief crossing her ruined features. She raised her hand in blessing, then slowly faded from view, the clicking of the rosary beads lingering in the air long after she had vanished. The three stood in stunned silence, united by an experience none of them had been prepared for, and a burden of knowledge they could never unshare. "What happens now?" Frank finally asked. Catherine squared her shoulders. "Now we do our jobs." We document, we verify, we tell the story, the real story of what happened here. Not for sensation, but for truth, as they prepared to leave the hidden laboratory. Frank took one last look at the preserved body of Sister Marie Claire. "We'll give you a proper burial," he promised quietly. "You and all the others." The rosary in his pocket had grown warm, almost hot against his skin. He knew without checking that it was gone, returned at last to its rightful owner. The weeks following the discovery at St. Agatha's passed in a blur of official investigations, academic scrutiny, and media frenzy. Frank found himself at the center of a storm he had never anticipated, his name mentioned in newspapers and on radio broadcasts across the country. The story had all the elements that captured the public imagination: secret experiments, corrupted faith, and a decades-old cover-up finally exposed. The Louisiana Historical Society, with Catherine at the forefront, took custody of all documents found in the hidden laboratory. Experts from the CDC were called in to examine the preserved specimens, though they assured the nervous public that any biological agents would have long since become inert. Sister Marie Claire and the other victims received proper burial rites in a solemn ceremony attended by the Archbishop himself, who publicly apologized for the atrocities committed under the church's roof. Though he was careful to characterize Sister Agnes and her collaborators as rogue agents who had betrayed their vows. For Frank, the aftermath brought unexpected changes. Westland Properties, embarrassed by the negative publicity and facing legal challenges from the Historical Society, offered him a generous settlement in exchange for his silence about certain details of the discovery. He declined the money but agreed not to discuss the supernatural aspects of his experience: the spectral nun who had guided him, the mysteriously appearing key, the rosary that moved on its own. Those elements remained private, shared only with Margaret, Catherine, and Dr. Broussard, who had witnessed enough to shake his scientific skepticism. Frank used his sudden notoriety to secure a new position as a consultant for historical preservation projects, ensuring that future development would not destroy important sites before they could be properly documented. It was fulfilling work that paid better than demolition ever had. But as October gave way to November, Frank began to sense that his connection to St. Agatha's was not entirely severed. The dreams continued, Latin chants echoing through stone corridors, flickering candles illuminating faces half hidden by veils, the smell of incense mingling with formaldehyde. He would wake disoriented, certain he had been wandering the convent's halls. More disturbing were the moments when, fully awake, he would catch glimpses of figures at the edge of his vision, women in habits, watching him silently before disappearing when he turned to look directly at them. Never Sister Marie Claire, whose spirit seemed to have found peace, but others older, sterner faces that regarded him with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Margaret noticed the toll it was taking on him. "You're not sleeping," she observed one evening as they sat at dinner, "and you jump at every sound. Maybe you should talk to someone." "Who?" Frank asked with a bitter laugh. "A doctor who'll think I'm having a nervous breakdown? A priest who'll tell me to pray harder?" "I was thinking of Catherine," Margaret said gently. "She believes you, and she has access to resources, historical records that might help make sense of what's happening." Frank nodded reluctantly. Margaret was right. Catherine had become a friend and ally through the investigation, one of the few people who didn't look at him with doubt or concern when he referenced his experiences with Sister Marie Claire. The next day, he visited Catherine at her office in the Historical Society's headquarters, a converted antebellum home in the Garden District. She listened without interruption as he described the continuing visitations and dreams. "It's like they're trying to tell me something," he concluded. "But what more could there be? We found the laboratory, exposed the experiments. Sister Marie Claire has moved on. Why are the others still here?" Catherine's office was lined with books and artifacts, the organized chaos of a dedicated historian. She rose from her desk and crossed to a filing cabinet, retrieving a folder that she handed to Frank. "I've been doing some additional research on St. Agatha's. The convent's history goes back further than we initially thought, to the early 1800s. Before it was a convent, the property belonged to a doctor named Jean-Baptiste Mercier." Frank looked up sharply. "Mercier? That's similar to your surname." "Yes, I noticed that too." Catherine sat on the edge of her desk. Dr. Mercier was known for his controversial research into yellow fever. He believed the disease could be controlled and weaponized, ideas far ahead of his time and morally questionable even. Then Frank opened the folder to find a yellowed newspaper clipping featuring an etched portrait of a stern-faced man with deep-set eyes that seemed strangely familiar. "The property was donated to the church after Mercier's death in 1847, Catherine continued. "His daughter, Evangeline, became the first Mother Superior of St. Agatha's." "You think there's a connection?" Frank said slowly. "Between Mercier's research and what Sister Agnes was doing nearly a century later?" Catherine nodded. I think the convent may have harbored a secret tradition of scientific experimentation disguised as religious devotion, and given the similarity in names and your particular sensitivity to the site's history, Dotto quotes, you think I might be related to this doctor. It's possible. Many names were anglicized over time. Mercia could have become Mercer. Frank stared at the portrait, unsettled by the implications. So what are the spirits trying to tell me? That I'm somehow connected to all this horror? Or, Catherine suggested gently, that you're the one meant to end it. Family curses, unfinished business, these are powerful motifs in many cultural traditions, including those that shaped New Orleans. Frank closed the folder, suddenly weary. What am I supposed to do? The convent is being preserved as a historical site. The truth has been exposed. What more can there be? Catherine's expression turned grave. There's one detail I haven't shared publicly. Among Sister Agnes's papers, I found references to other sites, other convents and religious institutions where her collaborators were sent when St. Agatha's closed. If they continued their work elsewhere, double quotes, the implication hung in the air between them. The horror hadn't been contained to St. Agatha's, it had spread like the very disease they had sought to weaponize. I need names, Frank said, a new resolve hardening his voice. Locations. Whatever you have. Catherine hesitated. Frank, this isn't just your responsibility. It is, he insisted. You said it yourself. There's a connection. The spirits are coming to me for a reason. And if there are more laboratories, more victims. He thought of Sister Marie Claire's face, half destroyed but determined to reveal the truth. They deserve justice too. Catherine nodded slowly and reached for another folder. I've identified 3 possible locations. The first is a former monastery in rural Louisiana, about 50 miles north of here. It was closed in 1962 and has been abandoned ever since. Frank studied the information, a sense of purpose replacing his earlier fatigue. The spirits that haunted his dreams were not just remnants of St. Agatha's past, they were messengers, guides to a larger truth that was still unfolding. When can we leave? He asked. Tomorrow morning, Catherine replied without hesitation. I'll drive. As Frank left the Historical Society, the autumn sun was setting over New Orleans, casting long shadows across the historic buildings. In those shadows he thought he saw figures watching him, women in habits, their faces solemn with the weight of secrets long buried. But for the first time since the dreams began, he didn't feel afraid. He had work to do, truth to uncover, justice to deliver. The dead were patient. They had waited decades for someone to listen. They could wait one more night. The drive north took them through the changing Louisiana landscape, from the urban grid of New Orleans to the swampy bayous and eventually into rolling farmland punctuated by dense patches of forest. Frank sat quietly in the passenger seat of Catherine's Ford sedan, watching the scenery blur past while turning over everything they had learned. Tell me about this monastery, he finally said as they turned off the main highway onto a narrower rural road. Catherine kept her eyes on the uneven pavement ahead. St. Jerome's Abbey, founded in 1873. Like St. Agatha's, it operated largely independently from diocesan oversight. The monks were Benedictine, known for their scholarly pursuits. They maintained an impressive library and were respected for their knowledge of medicinal plants and traditional remedies. The perfect cover, Frank muttered. Exactly. According to the records I found, Sister Agnes corresponded regularly with the abbot, a man named Brother Thomas Labelle. After the closure of St. Agatha's, one of her collaborators, a Sister Marguerite, was transferred to a convent less than 5 miles from St. Jerome's. Convenient, Frank observed. Very. And here's where it gets interesting. In 1960, there was an outbreak of an unusual respiratory illness in the surrounding communities. 47 people died before it mysteriously subsided. The local health authorities were baffled by its sudden appearance and equally sudden disappearance. Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. They were still experimenting. 30 years later, it appears so. Shortly after the outbreak, the monastery was closed by order of the Archbishop. The official reason given was declining membership, but my research suggests there may have been an internal investigation that never became public. The road narrowed further, turning from pavement to gravel. Trees closed in on either side, branches forming a canopy that dimmed the midday light. No other cars passed them. What exactly are we hoping to find? Frank asked. The place has been abandoned for years. Evidence, Catherine replied simply. Confirmation that what happened at St. Agatha's wasn't isolated. And perhaps, double quotes, she hesitated. Perhaps what? Perhaps answers about your connection to all this. If you are indeed related to Dr. Mercia, there might be records at St. Jerome's that could explain why these spirits are drawn to you. They rounded a bend, and St. Jerome's Abbey appeared before them, a sprawling stone complex nestled against a hillside, its chapel spire rising above the surrounding trees. Unlike St. Agatha's, which had been hemmed in by urban development, the monastery stood in splendid isolation, as if the outside world had agreed to give it a wide berth. Catherine parked near the rusted iron gates that hung askew from stone pillars. A chain secured them together, but it was loose enough to allow them to squeeze through. The grounds were overgrown, nature reclaiming what man had abandoned. Weeds pushed through the cracks in the stone pathways, and vines climbed the walls of the buildings. The silence was profound. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. "It feels wrong," Frank said quietly as they approached the main entrance. "Like the whole place is holding its breath." Catherine nodded, her academic detachment momentarily faltering. "I feel it too." The massive wooden doors of the abbey were secured with a more modern padlock than the original fixtures would suggest. Catherine produced a key. "Historical Society privilege," she explained with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We maintain access to all registered historical sites in the state." The interior was cool and dim, smelling of dust and decay. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting pools of colored light across the stone floor of what had once been the entrance hall. Corridors branched off in 3 directions, and a grand staircase led to upper floors. "The library would be our best bet," Catherine said, consulting a small notebook. "East wing, 2nd floor." They moved through the abbey cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Most rooms had been cleared of furniture and personal effects when the monastery closed, leaving only built-in fixtures and heavier pieces. The chapel retained its pews and altar, though the cross that had once hung above it was conspicuously absent. The library, when they reached it, was a large rectangular room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves on all walls. Unlike the rest of the abbey, it appeared to have been left largely intact. Hundreds of volumes remained on the shelves, their leather bindings cracked and faded with age. "They left the books?" Frank asked, surprised. "Not all of them," Catherine replied, examining the shelves closely. "The more valuable ones would have been relocated. What remains would have been deemed either too common to be worth the trouble or too dangerous to be found elsewhere," Frank finished. He approached a section where the books appeared older than the rest, their bindings more ornate. Many of the titles were in Latin, but others were in French or English, covering topics. Frank ran his fingers along the spines of the ancient texts. Many titles related to medicine and botany, but others had more ominous theme treatises on plagues throughout history, studies of population control, and disturbing works on racial theories that had been discredited decades ago. "Catherine," he called, pulling a volume bound in dark leather from the shelf. "Look at this." The book was a handwritten journal, the pages yellowed but preserved. The inside cover bore a simple inscription, "Property of J.B. Mercier, 1842. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. The handwriting was tight and precise, the language clinical as it described experiments with various disease agents. Diagrams showed the progression of symptoms in test subjects referred to only by numbers. "My God," Catherine whispered, reading over his shoulder. "He was experimenting on people. Slaves, according to these entries." Frank felt sick as he read his possible ancestors' cold documentation of suffering. The journal detailed Mercier's efforts to isolate and enhance the virulence of yellow fever, theorizing that if properly controlled, it could be used to maintain social order by targeting specific populations. "He was a monster," Frank said hoarsely. "And Sister Agnes continued his work," Catherine added, pulling more volumes from the shelves. "Look, these are more recent. The newer journals documented experiments spanning from the 1930s through the 1950s. Different handwriting, but the same methodical approach to human suffering. The names Sister Agnes and Brother Thomas appeared frequently, along with references to test sites in rural communities where outbreaks could be attributed to natural causes. This goes beyond St. Agatha's, Catherine said, her face pale. This was an organized long-term effort spanning multiple institutions. As they continued their search, Frank felt the now familiar sensation of being watched. Turning suddenly, he caught a glimpse of a dark figure at the library entrance, not a nun this time, but a man in the black robes of a Benedictine monk. The figure vanished as soon as Frank's eyes fixed on it. "We're not alone here," he murmured to Catherine, who nodded grimly. "I've felt it since we entered. The dead have stories to tell here, too." They worked methodically through the library, photographing key documents and taking notes. As the afternoon wore on, they pieced together a horrifying narrative. Dr. Mercier's early experiments had evolved into a secretive program within certain Catholic institutions. justified by zealots like Sister Agnes as necessary for defending the faith against perceived threats to Western Christian civilization. "There's something I don't understand," Frank said as they prepared to explore the abbey's basement, where records suggested a laboratory had been concealed. "If I am related to Mercier, why would the spirits guide me to expose all this? Wouldn't they want to protect the family legacy?" Catherine considered this. Perhaps not all the Merciers agreed with the doctor's work, or perhaps the victim's need for justice outweighs family ties. Either way, you're here now, doing what needs to be done. The basement was accessed via a narrow stone staircase behind a door that had been disguised as a storage closet. Unlike the rest of the abbey, which felt abandoned but ordinary, the basement carried an immediate sense of wrongness. The air was stale and tinged with chemical odors that had persisted despite decades of vacancy. Frank's flashlight revealed a setup similar to what they had found at St. Agatha's, but larger, more sophisticated. Stone tables with drainage channels. Glass-fronted cabinets filled with specimens preserved in cloudy liquid. A row of what appeared to be isolation cells, complete with observation windows and restraint fixtures bolted to the walls. "They expanded their operation," Catherine said, her voice tight with controlled anger. St. Agatha's was just the beginning. In a small office adjacent to the main laboratory, they found more records, clinical notes, correspondence between the various participants, and maps marking outbreak locations across Louisiana, Mississippi, and eastern Texas. These weren't natural outbreaks, Frank realized, studying the maps. They were deliberately orchestrated, testing the effectiveness of their engineered diseases in different environments, against different populations. Catherine was examining a file cabinet in the corner. "Frank," she called, her voice strange. "I think you should see this." She handed him a folder labeled Bloodlines. Inside were genealogical charts tracking several family lines through multiple generations. The name Mercia featured prominently, branching out to include other surnames as marriages occurred across generations. And there, in a chart dated 1952, was a name that made Frank's blood run cold. Francis Mercer B., 1919. "My father," he whispered. Further notes revealed the truth. The Mercier bloodline had been monitored for generations by the secret group, looking for individuals who showed the same gift that had made Dr. Jean-Baptiste Mercier's work possible, a particular sensitivity to what they called the veil between worlds. They believed certain bloodlines could communicate with the dead, Catherine explained, reading through the notes. They used this ability in their work, claiming it gave them insights into the after effects of their experiments. "My dreams," Frank said numbly. "The spirits I've been seeing. It's not just because I found St. Agatha's. It's because you inherited this sensitivity," Catherine finished, "but you're using it differently than your ancestors did. You're listening to the victims, not exploiting them." A sound from the main laboratory interrupted them, the soft scrape of movement across stone. They returned to find they were no longer alone. Transparent figures filled the room, men in monks' robes, women in simple clothing that marked them as locals from bygone decades, even children. Unlike Sister Marie Claire, whose appearance had been partly solid, these spirits were more like impressions, faint images that flickered and wavered in the beam of Frank's flashlight. But their eyes were solid and intent, fixed on Frank with desperate urgency. One figure separated from the others, a monk with a scholarly stoop to his shoulders and wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He pointed to the far wall, where a large stone seemed slightly different from those surrounding it. Frank approached it cautiously. The stone moved under his touch, revealing a small recess behind it. Inside lay a leather-bound book and a small wooden box. The book contained what appeared to be the personal journal of Brother Thomas, the last abbot of St. Jerome's. The final entry was dated June 7, 1962. "The Archbishop's investigation leaves me no choice. The work must be protected at all costs. I have secured the primary cultures and research notes. Sister Marguerite will transport them to the third site tomorrow. God forgive what necessity has forced us to do. The truth of our work will remain hidden until a more enlightened time, when its value will be recognized." The wooden box contained a map with 3 locations marked in red ink: St. Agatha's, St. Jerome's, and a third site circled in the Ozark Mountains of northern Arkansas. "There's one more site," Frank said, looking up at Catherine. "They moved their research there in '62. The spirits around them seemed to grow more agitated, their forms flickering more rapidly as if expending precious energy to maintain their presence. They want us to find it," Catherine said softly, "to end this once and for all." Frank nodded, a deep resolve settling over him. The weight of his family's dark legacy pressed down on him, but also gave him clarity. He had been chosen not just by the dead, but by whatever force governed the universe's moral balance to right these wrongs. "We'll need help," he said. "Official channels. The evidence we've gathered here, combined with what was found at St. Agatha's, it should be enough to convince authorities to investigate the third site." Catherine nodded. "I have contacts at the FBI. With documentation this extensive, they'll have to act." As they gathered their evidence and prepared to leave St. Jerome's, the spirits gradually faded, their purpose fulfilled. But Frank knew they would return to his dreams, guiding him until justice was complete. The sun was setting as they emerged from the abbey, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds. The silence that had seemed oppressive when they arrived now felt more like peace, the quietude of a grave finally marked after years of neglect. "What happens after the third site?" Catherine asked as they walked back to the car. "When this is all over," Frank considered the question. The journey that had begun with a rattling rosary on a demolition site had become something far larger than he could have imagined, a reckoning with historical crimes, with his own family's past, and with the thin boundary between the living and the dead. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think the dead will tell me when they're ready." The autumn chill had deepened by the time Frank and Catherine returned to New Orleans, bringing with them the evidence collected from St. Jerome's Abbey. The following days were a whirlwind of official statements, confidential meetings, and careful documentation of everything they had discovered. True to her word, Catherine arranged a meeting with an FBI agent named Robert Harris, who specialized in historical crimes and cold cases. Initially skeptical, his demeanor changed as they presented their findings. The journals, the maps of orchestrated outbreaks, the documentation of human experimentations spanning more than a century. "This goes beyond a simple investigation," Agent Harris said after several hours of discussion in a private room at the Historical Society. "What you're describing is a conspiracy that would have required the complicity, or at least the willful ignorance, of church officials and possibly local governments. We're not asking you to expose the entire network," Frank explained, "just to investigate the third site before any evidence can be destroyed. There may still be active participants continuing this work." Harris studied the map they had found at St. Jerome's. "This location in Arkansas is it's marked as St. Elizabeth's Retreat. Does it still exist?" Catherine nodded. "It's listed as a spiritual retreat center, still operational but very private. Limited information is available about its activities. I'll need a few days to arrange the necessary warrants and put together a team," Harris said. "This needs to be handled carefully. If your suspicions are correct and there is an active laboratory there, we could be dealing with biohazardous materials." As they concluded the meeting, Harris pulled Frank aside. "Mr. F. Mercer, I understand you have a personal connection to this case, your family history, these experiences you've had." His tone was carefully neutral. "I respect that, but I need you to understand that the official investigation must proceed according to protocol. You cannot be directly involved." Frank had expected this. "I understand. But when you go to St. Elizabeth's, I want to be nearby. Not interfering, just present." Harris seemed about to refuse, then nodded reluctantly. "Stay at the nearest town. I'll keep you informed as much as I can." That night, Frank called Margaret to explain that he would be traveling to Arkansas. He told her everything now, the full truth about his family connection to the experiments, about the spirits who had guided him, about the responsibility he felt to see this through to the end. "I should be surprised," Margaret said after a long silence, "but somehow I'm not. There's always been something different about you, Frank. A sensitivity I couldn't quite name." Her voice softened. "My mother would have called it the sight. You're not afraid? Of who I am, of who my family was? We don't inherit the sins of our ancestors," Margaret said firmly. "We only inherit the responsibility to be better than they were. And you are, Frank. You're using this gift to help the dead find justice. That's something to be proud of." Her words stayed with him as he and Catherine drove north 3 days later, following the same route that Agent Harris and his team had taken. The journey to northern Arkansas took them through increasingly mountainous terrain, the forested hills of the Ozarks rising around them like silent sentinels. St. Elizabeth's Retreat was situated in a remote valley, accessible only by a single winding road that snaked through dense forest before opening onto a vista of well-maintained grounds, surrounding a complex of stone buildings. From a distance it appeared peaceful, even idyllic, a place of spiritual contemplation set apart from the world's distractions. Following Harris's instructions, they checked into a small motel in the nearest town, 10 miles from the retreat. That evening, the agent called to inform them that his team would execute their search warrant the following morning. "We've been conducting surveillance for the past 2 days," he explained. The retreat appears to operate normally on the surface. Religious visitors come and go. Daily services are held. But there's a separate building, accessible only through the main complex, where different personnel are seen entering. They wear what look like lab coats under their religious garments. They're still active, Frank said, a chill running through him. After all these years, we'll know for certain tomorrow. Stay in town, Mr. Mercer. I'll contact you when we've completed the operation, Frank agreed, but knew even as he spoke that he would not remain behind. The dreams had intensified since they'd crossed into Arkansas's vivid visions of white-coated figures moving through sterile corridors, of glass containers holding cloudy liquids, of subjects strapped to beds while observers took dispassionate notes on their suffering. And now there were new figures in his dreams, not just the nuns and monks he'd seen before, but men and women in modern dress, their eyes fixed on him with the same urgent need for recognition, for justice, for peace. I need to be closer, he told Catherine after hanging up the phone. Not inside, just ... nearby. The spirits are stronger here. They're trying to show me something. Catherine studied him, concern evident in her expression. Frank, Agent Harris was clear about protocol. I know. I won't interfere with the FBI operation. But there's something else happening here. Something they might not see. After a moment's hesitation, Catherine nodded. We'll go at dawn, find a position overlooking the retreat, but at the first sign of trouble, we leave. Agreed? Agreed. They set out before sunrise, driving to within a mile of St. Elizabeth's before continuing on foot through the forest. The autumn foliage provided good cover as they made their way to a ridge that offered a clear view of the retreat's grounds. Through binoculars, they watched as a convoy of unmarked vehicles approached the main entrance at precisely 8 a.m. Men and women in FBI jackets emerged, showing papers to the startled attendant at the gate. For the next hour, they observed the methodical execution of the search warrant agents moving from building to building. Retreat staff being gathered in the central courtyard for questioning, boxes of documents being carried out to the waiting vehicles. They're doing it by the book, Catherine observed. It's thorough, professional. Frank nodded, but his attention had shifted to something the agents couldn't see. Amidst the controlled chaos of the federal operation, ghostly figures moved freely across the grounds, dozens of them, from different eras, converging on a small outbuilding near the eastern edge of the complex. There, he said, pointing, that building with the red door. The spirits are trying to show us something there. Through the binoculars, Frank could see that the FBI team had not yet entered that particular structure. They were focused on the main complex and what appeared to be a more modern laboratory facility attached to it. We need to tell Agent Harris, Catherine said, reaching for her phone. Before she could dial, a sudden commotion erupted near the red-doored building. Two figures emerged, a man and a woman in religious garments, moving with surprising speed toward the forest on the far side of the retreat. They're running, Frank said. They must have documents or samples they don't want found. Without thinking, he started down the ridge toward the retreat, ignoring Catherine's call to stop. The spirits were more visible now, more insistent, forming a path that led him through the trees and across a corner of the grounds that remained unobserved by the FBI team. He reached the small outbuilding just as Agent Harris and two other agents approached it from the main complex. Their expressions registered surprise at his sudden appearance. "Mercer, what the hell are you doing here?" Harris demanded. "Two people fled from this building," Frank explained quickly. "Headed into the woods on the east side. And there's something important inside. Something the spirits are trying to show us." Harris looked as if he might order Frank removed from the premises, but something in his face, perhaps the absolute certainty in his voice, gave the agent pause. "Johnson, Peters, check the eastern perimeter. Look for tracks," he ordered the other agents. Then, to Frank, "You stay with me. Don't touch anything." The interior of the outbuilding was cool and dim, smelling of old paper and dust. Unlike the more modern laboratory they had glimpsed in the main complex, this space resembled an archive, walls lined with filing cabinets, shelves stacked with leather-bound volumes, a large oak table in the center covered with maps and charts. "This is their historical record," Frank said, the realization dawning as he took in the room's contents. Everything from the beginning, Mercier's original research, the work at St. Agatha's and St. Jerome's, all of it. Harris pulled on latex gloves before approaching the table. "This is extensive," he said, professional detachment wavering slightly as he examined the nearest documents. "These records go back to the 1840s. Frank moved as if in a trance, guided by an unseen presence to a particular filing cabinet in the far corner. "Here," he said. "There's something important here." Harris hesitated, then nodded for him to continue. Frank opened the drawer, finding it filled with folders labeled with years, each containing what appeared to be annual reports. but it was a small leather-bound book at the back of the drawer that drew his attention, identical to the one they had found at St. Jerome's, but newer, its pages filled with recent entries. "It's a current journal," Frank said, carefully lifting it out. "Dated this year." Harris took it from him, opening it to the most recent entry, less than a week old. "Final preparations complete for Phase 3 trial," he read aloud. "Subject selected from target demographic. Release scheduled for November 5th-10th in 3 test communities. If results match projections, full deployment to proceed as planned in spring." Frank and Harris exchanged a look of horror. "They're still active," Frank said. "Still developing biological weapons. And they're planning to release something next month. We need to find those 2 who fled," Harris said, his voice tight with urgency. "They'll know details, locations, methods, personnel." As if in answer, a sound came from outside, shouting, then the sharp crack of gunfire. Harris drew his weapon. "Stay here," he ordered Frank, moving quickly to the door. But Frank was already following, driven by the same certainty that had guided him since that first day at St. Agatha's. Outside, agents were converging on the eastern edge of the property, where the fleeing figures had disappeared into the forest. And there, visible only to Frank, stood a crowd of spirits, men, women, and children from across the decades, their transparent forms forming a pathway into the trees. At their head stood a figure he recognized immediately, a young woman in a novice's habit, her face whole and beautiful now, no longer marked by decay. Sister Marie Claire beckoned to him, her expression urgent. Frank followed. The forest closed around Frank like a living thing, branches reaching for him as he pushed deeper into the wilderness. Behind him, the sounds of the FBI operation grew fainter, shouted commands. The crackle of radios, the occasional burst of activity when a new discovery was made. Ahead lay only the hushed stillness of ancient trees and the ghostly figures that guided his path. Sister Marie Claire moved before him, her form more substantial than he had ever seen it, glowing with a soft luminescence that lit the way through the deepening shadows. Behind her, a procession of other spirits created a flickering trail through the underbrush, victims from different eras united in their silent urgency. Frank lost track of time as he followed this supernatural escort, his mind focused only on the pursuit. The 2 fugitives, the man and woman who had fled the retreat, had a head start, but they were weighed down by whatever they had taken from the archive, and they didn't have guides who knew every hidden path through these mountains. The trail began to slope upward, the terrain growing rockier. Frank's breathing became labored as he climbed, but the spirits maintained their pace, indifferent to the physical limitations of the living. Occasionally he would spot evidence of those he pursued, broken branch, disturbed leaves, once a dropped piece of paper that proved to be a page torn from a research journal. He was so focused on the trail that he almost missed the subtle change in the spirits' behavior. They had stopped their forward progress and were now gathered around what appeared to be a solid rock face, half hidden by thick vegetation. Sister Marie Claire turned to Frank, her expression solemn as she pointed to the seemingly impenetrable barrier. Frank approached cautiously, pushing aside the curtain of vines. What had appeared to be solid stone was in fact cleverly disguised. Metal door painted and textured to blend perfectly with the surrounding rock. It stood slightly ajar. "A hidden entrance," Frank murmured, understanding dawning. "The retreat isn't their only facility." The spirits flickered in what seemed like affirmation. Sister Marie Claire moved to stand beside the door, gesturing for him to proceed. Frank hesitated. He should go back, inform Agent Harris about this discovery. The FBI was equipped to handle whatever lay beyond that door. He was just a former demolition foreman who had stumbled into a decades-old conspiracy. But even as these thoughts passed through his mind, he knew he would continue forward. This was his burden to bear, his family's legacy to confront. The dead had chosen him. He slipped through the door into a narrow tunnel carved directly into the mountain. Electric lights in protective cages ran along the ceiling, illuminating a passageway that sloped gently downward. The air was cool and artificial, moving in a steady current that suggested ventilation systems were at work. Frank moved as quietly as he could, alert for any sound that might reveal the presence of others. The tunnel continued for perhaps 100 yards before opening into a larger space that took his breath away. Hollowed from the living rock of the mountain was a vast chamber that housed what could only be described as an underground research facility. Multiple levels connected by metal staircases contained laboratory spaces, storage areas, and what appeared to be living quarters. The technology was modern, far more sophisticated than what they had found at St. Agatha's or St. Jerome's. And unlike those abandoned sites, this facility was clearly active. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, computer terminals glowed on desks, and scientific equipment whirred softly in the background. But there were no people visible, just the lingering evidence of a space recently and hastily vacated. They knew we were coming, Frank realized. Not just the FBI raid today, they'd been preparing for discovery, maybe for years. He moved carefully through the facility, taking in details that told a story of long-term, well-funded research. Unlike the crude experiments documented in the earlier sites, this operation had all the hallmarks of sophisticated modern science gene sequencing equipment. Climate-controlled storage units, advanced computational systems. In what appeared to be the main laboratory, Frank found evidence of what they had been working on. Glass-fronted refrigeration units contained rack upon rack of labeled samples. Computer screens displayed molecular structures and simulation results. Bulletin boards held maps with locations marked across the southern United States. And there, on a central workstation, lay a leather-bound journal similar to the one they had found in the archive, but filled with technical notations that went beyond Frank's understanding. He was photographing pages with a small camera Catherine had given him when a sound from deeper in the facility caught his attention, a metallic clang, followed by voices. Frank quickly ducked behind a row of storage cabinets. Moments later, the two fugitives he had been following entered the laboratory, the man tall and gaunt with wire-rimmed glasses, the woman shorter with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Both wore religious garments now partially covered by white lab coats. "We can't take everything," the woman was saying, her voice tight with urgency. "Just the primary cultures and the latest research notes." "What about the subjects?" the man asked, gesturing toward a doorway on the far side of the laboratory. "They're already in the transport vehicle. Brother Michael will take them to Site 4. Our priority is the research materia. Represents decades of work." Frank's blood ran cold. Subjects. Human test subjects being moved to yet another secret location. The spirits that had guided him here were now moving about the laboratory, their forms passing through solid objects as they examined equipment and peered at documents. Their agitation was growing, their movements more erratic. Sister Marie Claire appeared beside Frank, her expression anguished as she pointed toward the doorway the man had indicated, the one that supposedly led to where subjects had been held. Frank understood. He needed to see what was through that door, to document the final piece of evidence that would expose the full horror of what had been happening here. But first, he needed to deal with the two researchers who were now efficiently packing materials into metal cases designed for secure transport. Frank weighed his options. He was unarmed, facing two people who had dedicated their lives to a cause that had already claimed countless victims. But he also knew that help wasn't far behind. Agent Harris and his team would be searching the forest, perhaps already following his trail. He needed to stall. Taking a deep breath, Frank stepped out from his hiding place. "It's over," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "The FBI's right behind me. They know about this facility." The two researchers froze, their expressions shifting from shock to calculation. The man's hand moved slowly toward a drawer in the workstation. "I wouldn't," Frank warned. "Agent Harris has a team surrounding this mountain. There's nowhere to go." "You're lying," the woman said coldly. "Came alone. Guided by them, I imagine." She gestured vaguely at the air around them, and Frank realized with a shock that she could see the spirits too. "You're a Mercier," the man said, studying Frank's face. "I can see it in your features. The family resemblance is quite strong." "Not just in appearance," the woman added. "You have the gift. Just like your great-great-grandfather. Just like some of us." "I'm nothing like you," Frank said, disgust rising in his throat. "You've used this gift to cause suffering, to develop weapons that have killed innocent people. We've used it to protect our way of life," the man countered. "To develop tools that could save Western civilization from those who would destroy it from within. By targeting specific populations with engineered diseases," Frank said. "That's not protection. That's genocide." "Precise intervention," the woman corrected. "And you could be part of it. The Mercier bloodline has always been central to our work. Your sensitivity to the veil between worlds gives our research direction, purpose." "My name is Mercer," Frank said firmly, "and I'm here to end what my ancestors started." The man sighed, as if disappointed by a promising student's failure to grasp a simple concept. "You can't end it. The work will continue. There are others, many others committed to the cause." As they spoke, Frank had been gradually moving toward the doorway Sister Marie Claire had indicated. The spirits were growing more numerous, filling the laboratory with their flickering forms, creating a distraction that the living researchers seemed to find unsettling. "The dead don't agree with you," Frank said, gesturing to the crowded room. "They want justice." "The dead should stay dead," the woman snapped, her composure cracking slightly. "And soon they will." Her hand moved suddenly to a panel on the wall, a series of switches protected by a clear plastic cover. She flipped the cover up. This facility has served its purpose, she said, like St. Agatha's and St. Jerome's before it. But we always prepare for contingencies. Frank lunged forward, but too late. Her hand came down on the switches, and immediately alarms began to sound throughout the complex. Red warning lights flashed from the ceiling. Self-destruct sequence initiated, an automated voice announced, "All personnel evacuate immediately. 15 minutes to containment purge." The woman smiled coldly. "Enough time for us to leave. Not enough for your FBI friends to find what they're looking for." She nodded to her companion, who had finished securing the transport cases. "After you, Brother Thomas." As they moved toward the tunnel entrance, Frank made his decision. He could pursue them, possibly capture them before they escaped, or he could investigate what lay beyond that other doorway, potentially finding the human subjects they had mentioned. The spirits made the choice clear. All of them, dozens now, were pointing toward the unexplored doorway. Sister Marie Claire's expression was desperate with urgency. Frank ran for the door. Beyond it lay a corridor with several rooms branching off, what had clearly been containment units for test subjects. Each room contained a hospital-style bed with restraint fixtures, monitoring equipment, and observation windows. But all were empty, except the last one. Inside, huddled in a corner, was a young woman in a hospital gown. She looked up as Frank entered, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. "Are you here to take me to the next place?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "No," Frank said gently, approaching slowly so as not to frighten her further. "I'm here to help you get out. The FBI is outside. They'll make sure you're safe." She didn't move. "There were others. 5 of us. They took the others already." "When?" "Just before the alarms. A man came. They called him Brother Michael. He took them in a van." The facility's warning system continued its countdown. 12 minutes to containment purge. "We need to go," Frank urged, extending his hand to the young woman. "This place is going to self-destruct." She hesitated, then reached out to take his offered hand. As she stood, Frank saw bruises on her arms where 4 lines had recently been removed. "What's your name?" he asked as they moved quickly back through the laboratory. "Anna," she replied. "Anna Ledet. I'm from Lafayette. They said they were a medical research foundation, that the treatments might help my condition." Her voice broke. "But they lied. They were making us sick on purpose, testing things on us." Frank led her toward the tunnel entrance, painfully aware of the countdown continuing in the background. 10 minutes. 9 minutes. They had just reached the tunnel when a deafening explosion rocked the facility. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as lights flickered and died. "They've accelerated the sequence," Frank realized aloud. "We need to run." They sprinted through the tunnel, the emergency lighting providing just enough illumination to avoid obstacles. Behind them, a series of smaller explosions suggested that various sections of the facility were being systematically destroyed, along with all evidence of what had happened there. The metal door at the tunnel's end appeared ahead, still standing open. Frank pushed Anna through first, following close behind as they emerged into the forest. The afternoon sun momentarily blinded them after the dim, artificial light of the underground complex. "Which way?" Anna asked, panic edging her voice as the ground beneath them trembled with another explosion. Frank looked for guidance, but the spirits had vanished. Then he heard it, voices calling from the forest to their right. Human voices. "This way," he said, taking Anna's arm to support her as they moved as quickly as possible through the underbrush. They had gone perhaps 50 yards when the mountain seemed to shudder. A deep rumbling sound was followed by a concussive blast that knocked them off their feet. Looking back, Frank saw a plume of dust and debris rising from what appeared to be a collapsing section of the mountainside. "The whole facility is caving in," he said as they struggled back to their feet. "We need to get farther away." They pressed on, the sounds of destruction gradually fading behind them. After another few minutes of difficult progress through the forest, they emerged into a small clearing and found themselves face to face with Agent Harris and 3 other FBI agents, all with weapons drawn. "Mercer!" Harris exclaimed, lowering his gun. "What the hell happened back there? And who is this?" "Her name is Anna Ledet," Frank explained quickly. "She was being held as a test subject in a hidden facility inside the mountain. There were 5 others, but they were moved before we got there." He looked at Anna for confirmation. She nodded, her face pale. "They took my friends to some place called Site 4. Please, you have to find them. They're going to keep hurting them." Harris holstered his weapon, his expression grim. "We found the 2 from the retreat trying to reach a vehicle hidden off the main road. They're in custody, but they're not talking." He glanced at the rising dust cloud visible above the trees. "What was that explosion?" "Self-destruct sequence," Frank said. "They had the whole place rigged to destroy all evidence. But it doesn't matter. We have Anna's testimony, the documents from the archive at the retreat, and everything we found at St. Agatha's and St. Jerome's. It's enough to expose the whole operation." Harris nodded slowly. "And this Site 4? The woman mentioned it. The one we captured," Frank recalled. "She said someone named Brother Michael was taking the subjects there. We'll get it out of him," Harris said with quiet determination. "Now let's get you both back to safety. Miss Leggett clearly needs medical attention. And you look like you could use some too." As they made their way back toward the retreat, Frank found himself searching the forest for any sign of the spirits that had guided him this far, but they remained absent, their purpose apparently fulfilled for now. Yet he knew this wasn't truly the end. There was still Site 4 to find, still other subjects to rescue, still justice to be delivered for countless victims across the decades. The conspiracy had been exposed, but its full extent remained unknown. And somewhere in the mountains, Brother Michael was transporting 5 more innocent victims to continue the terrible work begun by Jean-Baptiste Mercier more than a century ago. Frank's journey wasn't over. It had only entered a new phase. As they reached the edge of the retreat's grounds, now swarming with FBI personnel and emergency vehicles, Frank thought he caught a glimpse of a familiar figure standing apart from the chaos, a young woman in a novice's habit. Her face whole and serene, watching him with an expression of profound gratitude before fading from sight. The dead had guided him this far, and they would guide him still until every victim found peace, until every perpetrator faced justice, until the terrible legacy of the Mercier bloodline was finally irrevocably broken. 6 months after the events at St. Elizabeth's retreat, Frank Mercer sat in the witness box of a federal courthouse in Little Rock, Arkansas. The room was packed with journalists, government officials, and family members of victims identified throughout the investigation. Outside, protesters from various religious groups held vigils, some defending the church as an institution separate from the actions of rogue members, others demanding greater accountability. Frank's testimony had lasted for 3 days, detailing everything from his first encounter with the rattling rosary at St. Agatha's to the rescue of Anna Leggett from the mountain facility. He had been careful to focus on the documented evidence, mentioning the supernatural elements only when directly questioned, and then framing them as intuitions or impressions rather than claiming to have seen spirits. The 2 researchers captured at St. Elizabeth's, identified as Dr. Eleanor Broussard and Dr. Thomas Wilkins, both with legitimate scientific credentials alongside their religious personas, had eventually broken under interrogation. Their testimony had led to raids on 3 additional facilities across the southern United States, including the elusive Site 4 in the remote mountains of East Tennessee. 16 test subjects had been rescued alive. 23 graves had been exhumed. Hundreds of documents had been seized, revealing a network that extended far beyond what Frank had initially uncovered. "Mr. Mercer," the prosecutor said, bringing Frank's attention back to the present moment in your investigation of these facilities, "did you find any evidence that governmental agencies were aware of or involved in these activities?" Frank hesitated. This was the question many had been waiting for, the extent to which official entities might have known about or even sanctioned the research. The documents recovered from all 4 sites suggest that certain individuals within various agencies may have been aware of aspects of the program, he answered carefully. There are communications that reference official protection and governmental interests. However, I found no evidence of formal institutional involvement. Rather, it appears that sympathetic individuals in positions of authority provided cover and occasionally resources. The prosecutor nodded, satisfied with the measured response. "And based on your extensive review of the historical records, what would you say was the primary motivation behind this century-long program of human experimentation?" Frank thought of all he had read, Mercier's original journals, Sister Annis's clinical notes, the modern research protocols found at the mountain facility. Behind the scientific language and religious justifications lay a consistent theme. Control, he said simply. The ability to selectively target populations deemed undesirable by those in power. The earliest documents from Dr. Mercier explicitly discussed using disease as a means of maintaining social hierarchies. Later iterations cloaked these same goals in religious language about purifying society or defending certain values. But the fundamental aim never changed. They were developing biological weapons that could target specific genetic markers or affect communities with particular characteristics. And were they successful? Had they developed such capabilities? Frank glanced at Anna Leggett, who sat in the gallery between Catherine and Agent Harris. Her health had been permanently damaged by the experiments performed on her. But she had emerged as a powerful voice for the victims, testifying before Congress and speaking to the media about her experience. Partially, Frank answered. The modern facilities had made significant advances in creating pathogens with specific targeting capabilities. But according to the experts who examined their research, they were still years away from the precision they sought. That didn't stop them from conducting field tests, however. The outbreaks documented throughout the past century were their attempts to refine their methods, with complete disregard for human life. As the testimony concluded and the court adjourned for the day, Frank found himself surrounded by the now familiar team that had formed around this case: Catherine, Agent Harris, Anna, and several other investigators who had become friends through their shared purpose. "You did well today," Catherine told them as they exited the courthouse through a side door to avoid the press. "Clear, factual, compelling." "I just told the truth," Frank said. "Or most of it, anyway." Harris gave him a knowing look. Throughout the investigation, the FBI agent had maintained a professional skepticism about Frank's more supernatural experiences, while simultaneously developing a profound respect for his insights and determination. "Some truths are better left for private conversations," Harris said quietly. "What matters is that justice is being served." As they walked to the government vehicles that would transport them back to their hotel, Anna fell into step beside Frank. "Have you seen any of them lately?" she asked in a low voice. Unlike Harris, Anna had never questioned Frank's accounts of spiritual guidance. Having been subjected to unimaginable horrors in the name of science, her perspective on what was possible in the world had been fundamentally altered. "Not since we found the last facility," Frank admitted. I think they're at peace now. "We're getting there," Anna nodded thoughtfully. "I still feel them sometimes. Not seeing them like you did, but a presence, especially at night. Like they're standing guard," Frank understood. The victims, both the dead and the living, had formed a bond that transcended ordinary experience. They protected each other now, across the boundary that separated their worlds. Back at the hotel, as the others dispersed to their rooms to prepare for the next day's proceedings, Catherine pulled Frank aside. "There's something I've been meaning to show you," she said, retrieving a folder from her briefcase. "I finally got access to some sealed diocesan records that might interest you." Inside the folder was a photograph Frank had never seen before, a formal portrait of a family from the late 19th century. A stern-faced man in a dark suit stood behind a seated woman and 3 children. "That's Jean-Baptiste Mercier," Catherine said, pointing to the man. "And beside him is his wife, Marie. The children are their daughters, Evangeline, who became the first Mother Superior of St. Agatha's, Louise, who married into a banking family, and Claudette, the youngest." Frank studied the faces, seeing echoes of his own features in Mercier's strong jaw and deep-set eyes. But it was the youngest daughter who truly caught his attention. Unlike the others, whose expressions ranged from solemn to severe, Claudette had a subtle defiance in her gaze, a hint of rebellion in the slight tilt of her chin. "What happened to Claudette?" he asked. Catherine smiled slightly. "That's where it gets interesting. According to the records, she strongly opposed her father's work. There are letters where she describes it as an abomination before God and man. When she was 20, she ran away from home. The family reported her missing, but privately. Mercier wrote that she had betrayed the family legacy and was dead to him. Frank felt a strange lightening in his chest. She got out. She broke away. She did more than that, Catherine continued. She resurfaces in records from 1890 in New York, where she married a dock worker named Patrick Mercer. The revelation hit Frank like a physical force. "My great-grandfather," he whispered. Catherine nodded. "You're not descended from Jean-Baptiste Mercier through a son who changed the spelling of the name as we initially thought. You're descended from his rebel daughter, who deliberately took a new name to distance herself from her father's legacy. So when Sister Annis's group was monitoring the Mercier bloodline, they were tracking the descendants of all 3 daughters, not realizing that Claudette's line had explicitly rejected the family's dark purpose." Catherine's expression was triumphant. "You didn't inherit a curse, Frank. You inherited a resistance." The pieces clicked into place in Frank's mind. Why the spirits had chosen him. Why he had felt compelled to expose what others had hidden. Why the connection that the researchers had tried to exploit had instead become their undoing. "Claudette broke the cycle," he said softly. "And now we've finished what she started." Later that night, alone in his hotel room, Frank dreamed not of clinical horrors or spectral nuns, but of a young woman in 19th century dress, her chin held high as she walked away from a grand house without looking back. In his dream, she turned once to meet his gaze across the decades, a look of recognition and approval in her eyes before she continued on her journey. The trial would continue for weeks. The public reckoning would last for years. The task of healing for the survivors, for the communities affected, for the institutions implicated would be the work of generations. But as Frank drifted in that space between sleeping and waking, He felt a peace he hadn't known since the day the rosary had rattled across the rubble of St. Agatha's convent. The dead had found their voice. The living would now tell their story, and the legacy of Jean-Baptiste Mercier had finally irrevocably been transformed from one of hidden horrors to one of exposed truth. In 1957, when workers demolished the New Orleans convent, rosaries rattled alone across the rubble. And in 2025, when the last facility was finally closed and cleansed, those same rosaries could at last be still, their purpose fulfilled, their burden lifted, their prayers answered. Frank Mercier, descendant of rebels, friend to the departed, would make sure of it.